So many things you can be grateful for George Washington. Again, his faith, his leadership, his adherence to the Constitution, or the idea of a Constitution, his willingness to sacrifice personal pride, personal gain, the security of his family in a monarchy down through history for this nascent new republic. I'm Dr. Duke, and this is Constitution Corner. Well, a presidential election year on a recently celebrated President's Day gives us a really wonderful opportunity to talk about the first president. And if we had even a handful of presidents who were like our first president, the country would be in much better shape and much more solid with its regard, respect, and willingness to follow the Constitution. George Washington was a remarkable man. You know, as a university professor, I see it all the time, and I predicted this about 10 years ago. When they were getting rid of the Confederate flag all across the country, the argument being that the Confederate flag symbolizes nothing but racism, that anybody who fought for that flag must be a monster and is irredeemable. People like Robert E. Lee were being dumped on the dustbin of history. And I said something, and I'm sure others did as well, but it immediately dawned on me that if we concede to this, if we make the argument that everyone who fought under the Confederate flag, by definition, was a racist, a bigot, and a monster, then we're going to set a very dangerous precedent here, because the American flag, as we know it today, in a slightly modified version, flew over slave states a lot longer than the Confederate flag did. If we're going to concede that the Confederate flag just means racism, well, then that same argument must hold, must it not, for the American flag? And the way they were coming after Thomas Jefferson because he owned slaves, it was inevitable they were going to get to George Washington. The way that we have removed Christopher Columbus now from Columbus Day, George Washington now is becoming in the crosshairs for a variety of reasons. He's the face we put with the founding of the country. And to progressives, that face is the face of bigotry, slaveholding, racism, misogyny, right? So when I think about George Washington, when I think about George Washington on this holiday weekend, and it's a holiday weekend, by the way, that's gotten awfully confused. It was always George Washington's Day. He was born February 22nd, 1732. And up until relatively recently, this day was celebrated for him exclusively. By the end of the 19th century, and then again in the 1980s, a series of decisions and popular movements pushed Washington's birthday to the collectivist President's Day. And quite honestly, our presidents don't really deserve a day for Washington. The ups and downs of our presidents, the clown shows and the Constitution shredders, the big debt runner-uppers, the anti-Second Amendmenters. We've had quite a run of presidents, but we stop and think for a moment about George Washington. Here's a guy who was actually offered a crown. That after fighting for liberty, after being the unifying force for the American Revolution, for the colonialists, he was the man around whose banner everybody rallied. It weren't for him. It wasn't even less. It was less his generalship. It was less his all-abiding faith. It was the fact that he was the rallying cry. Here was a good old-fashioned, very tall man. He was a patrician. He was he would have fit really nicely into the British aristocracy. You could see him being in the House of Lords. He represented everything that the British Empire had come to be. And with all of that stature and all of that grandeur and all of that awareness of pride in place, he put it all on the line to help a struggling band of rebels take on the mightiest empire the world had seen to that point. And when you think about George Washington, he was offered a crown. The early colonialists, the earliest patriots found him so inspiring, found his leadership so magnetic, found his sacrifices, willing to sacrifice, so beautiful, that they offered him a crown and he turned it down. There's a great story that crazy old King George back in England, he was approached when Washington turned down a crown. Refused to be king, chose a presidential system and a democratic election system over a hereditary monarchy. One of King George's advisors went into the room and said to him, "Sire, we hear from America that George Washington just turned down a crown." At which point George III said, "If he does that, he will be the greatest man in history." And he's certainly in contention for the greatest man in history. Everything that monarchy represented, everything that the world had known, the West had known prior to the foundation of the United States, under a Republican form of government. Said go back to the kingdom, stress monarchy. Even when the British themselves overthrew their own king, Charles, in the early 17th century, after a short interregnum, they brought back the monarchy. For George Washington to reject this is an amazing thing. There's so many things you can be grateful for George Washington. Again, his faith, his leadership, his adherence to the Constitution, or the idea of a Constitution, his willingness to sacrifice personal pride, personal gain, the security of his family in a monarchy down through history for this nascent new republic shows both his common sense and his love of freedom. And whatever demerits Washington had, all people do. There is no figure in human history to whom you can't point at and say in this way or this way or this way he was imperfect. Of course Washington was imperfect. But what's perfect about him was his clarity and his willingness to sacrifice for this burgeoning young country. We owe him a holiday of his own. This has been Liberty News Hour. As always, you can go to thenewamerican.com and jbs.org for more information on these topics and more shows.